So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today. The title of our session today is Impacts and Challenges of Plastic Pollution Facing the Great Lakes Basin. My name is April Wepler, and I am the Engagement Coordinator for the Healthy Great Lakes Program at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. And I'll start with a land acknowledgement. I'm calling in today from Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Six Nations of the Grand Watershed. And I'll tell you a little bit about CELA, for those who might not know us. The Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA, is a specialty legal clinic within the Ontario-wide network of clinics funded by Legal Aid Ontario. We work to protect human health and our environment by seeking justice for those harmed by pollution and by working to change those policies to prevent such problems in the first place. As a legal aid clinic, our top priority is to represent low-income individuals and communities and to speak up for those with less influence and who receive less of a say in decision-making. So first off, a little bit of housekeeping about Zoom and how today's meeting is going to run. So we're going to ask everyone to turn your videos off and to keep your lines muted for the entire duration of the meeting. We have a lot of people on the line and we want to ensure the quality of the session. If you have any questions, you are welcome to pose those at any time using the chat box. So at any time you can ask your questions in the chat box. We're not going to use a Q&A feature or anything like that. Just the chat is going to be our tool for today. And we'll take those questions at the end of the session. If time allows, we'll get to as many of those as we can. So because of the number of attendees on the line today, if we do have any challenges with the audio quality, I may have to mute some lines. And if we have any consistent problem with those lines, may have to remove attendees. So please do your best to keep your lines muted. And a note that we are recording the session today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce some of the excellent staff and hosts that we have for our webinar today. So on the line from CELA, we have Crystal Ann Roussel, who is our articling student, and she's going to help with some of our screen sharing and technical aspects today. We also have Faye DeLeon, who's a researcher and paralegal with CELA. She's our meeting organizer today and also one of our speakers. And then also John Jackson and Michael Murray are on the line with us today as the co-chairs of the Toxics Free Great Lakes Binational Network. And I'll be passing the microphone over to John in just a moment. But before I do that, I'd like to get a better sense of who we have on the call with us today. Let in a few more people there. There we go. So let's do that through some polls. So the very first poll that we're going to put up here, hopefully you can see this on your screen now. The first poll question asks, what sector do you represent? We have a series of options here. If you can just tell us a bit about what sector you are with. And of course, if we've missed a sector, if you're clicking on other and you want to tell us who you are, you can use the chat function for that. Okay, I'm just going to leave this open for a couple more seconds. Great. Looks like most of you have answered. So here we go. We have, looks like about half of our participants today from environmental organizations, close to a quarter from government, number of academic and students, some industry representatives as well, and then lots in the other. Concerned citizen. Yes, that's a category we should have. I like that. So just a note about the different sectors represented today. It's so great to see folks from a variety of sectors, including industry representatives, members of the media, lots of people on the line interested in this topic. And we always value hearing a diversity of views through the chat box, as we mentioned in our discussion at the end. And just a friendly reminder to everyone to be respectful and open-minded in listening to today's presentation and hearing others' viewpoints. It's so important for us to have a good discussion today. The next thing I would really love to know is where you are all from. So just to make it extra fun, we ask which watershed you're from. So if you want to go ahead and tell us what watershed you're located in, and if we missed you here, there's the other category. We also have unsure if you're not quite sure which watershed you might be in. Give this just a couple more seconds to give people a chance to vote. Great. Let's share this back so you can see. I've actually never seen this happen, a tie between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Logical with our topic today, I guess. Usually Lake Ontario is the clear winner. So
Lake Michigan, it didn't take mine until whatever, you already closed it.
That's okay, thanks. right. So a couple from Lake Michigan, St. Lawrence River, and then a number in other. And again, you're welcome to tell us in the chat box where you are located today. And the last thing, this is a really helpful question for our speakers to get a sense of the level of knowledge of people on the call about today's topic. So if you can rate your knowledge about today's webinar topic in this poll question, please. All right, and we'll share this back as well so everyone can see. So most of our call participants, over 0.5%, saying they're somewhat familiar with the topic. Lots of knowledge and some not at all familiar. So lots to learn for all of us, which is great. All right, without further ado at this point, I think I will pass the microphone over to John. John, unless there's anything I'm forgetting to do at this point, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, April. I'm really delighted to see so many people here, and also the range of people who are participating is just really great, and it's exciting. I'm a co-chair, the Canadian co-chair of the Toxics Free Great Lakes Binational Network, and you see our new logo up there. We're quite excited to start up to. We're so excited to have our new logo up. And the co-chair from the US side is Michael Murray, and he's with National Wildlife Federation. The purpose of the Toxics Free Great Lakes Binational Network is, as implied by the name, binational, working across the border, and we focus very much on the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Are the governments fulfilling the promises that they made us? Are decisions being made on the basis of the principles in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that we all hold so dear? And the final word being network. It's the idea, our idea is to be pulling together citizens groups from across the basin to work together, to come up with recommendations and actions together. And of course, then to flip right back to the very beginning, toxics free, consistent with the Great Lakes water quality is, zero discharge, virtual elimination of persistent toxic substances. So every part of that has real significance to us. Our focus today is going to be on, in talking about plastics pollution facing the Great Lakes. And you'll see that we're going to look first at, very quickly, what's the condition of the lakes, what sort of plastic threats are there, to then look at a very complicated subject, which is the issue of the international agreements, binational agreements between Canada and the US and the Basin Convention. And then finally to look at one example of a proposal that could have toxics and it could have plastics moving back and forth across the border. So we'll get immediately to our first speaker, and who's going to talk about why the plastics are a problem in the Great Lake. And our speaker here is Sherry Mason, Sustainability Coordinator at Penn State Behrend. And Sam, are you there? Are you ready to go?
Hello, I am here. I couldn't share my screen until Crystal Ann stopped, so hopefully everybody can see my screen now. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you, John, for introducing me. So when we think about plastic pollution, I think many people have heard of it, and I think most people think of it with regard to an oceanic issue, with various organisms being kind of prominently featured in the news because of the impacts of plastic is having on them. And scientific studies over the last 20 years have certainly set the stage for the fact that the reality that within our oceans, plastic pollution is a major issue. And all 5 of the oceanic gyres have been shown to have these mass accumulations of anthropogenic debris, the vast majority of which is plastic. But if we look upstream from the oceans, studies have shown that the plastic is making its way to the oceans through freshwater systems. And we happen to live on the largest freshwater ecosystem in the entire world, the Laurentian Great Lakes, and are very fortunate to have these as our backyard. My research group has sailed and sampled all 5 of these Great Lakes, and I'm going to present about 5 years worth of scientific studies in one slide right here. And what we've seen from these studies is that all 5 of the Great Lakes have significant contributions of plastic pollutions floating along their lake surface. With Lake Superior, Lake Ontario, and Lake Erie being the most contaminated of the Great Lakes. If we account for the sizes or the surface areas of these lakes, we see that the Great Lakes, each of them individually, contain somewhere from 1 billion to 4.5 billion pieces of plastic strewn across their lake surface. And if you notice, I said 1 billion to 4.5, it would seem that I'm ignoring that 200 million in Lake Huron. And that's largely because this is the least studied of the 5 Great Lakes. We only have about 10 samples from across the entire Lake Huron surface. Given that geologically speaking, Lake Huron and Lake Michigan are one lake that are interconnected through the Straits of Mackinac, one would kind of reason that they're probably consistent between the two. In terms of what is a plastic particle, so the numbers themselves are shocking, but the reality is the vast majority of these particles are incredibly small. And in fact, as you go to smaller and smaller size ranges, you find more and more particles of plastic. Most of these plastics are what are classified as fragments. That is, there's something that broke off of something that was bigger, right? So one plastic item can form millions of plastic particles as it goes through this photooxidative degradation, mostly a mechanical degradation process. We do also find pellets, which are round, spherical, or cylindrically shaped plastic particles, as well as fibers and lines that most likely, or most, kind of significantly likely come through either fishing lines or through our clothing. So this is what we see along the lake surface. If we move upstream from the lakes into our rivers, we see that the concentrations of plastics increase even more than what we see in the Great Lakes. And this makes sense because you're closer to the people, which are the ultimate source of these plastics, as well as having less water for the dilution of these plastic particles. And so the concentration is higher. Our initial studies within the tributaries of the Great Lakes really focused on microplastics, but right before COVID hit and COVID shut it down, we had started within Erie, Pennsylvania, looking at macro items that we find within our rivers. And we got shut down, so I don't have data from that to share with you guys today, but I did want to share kind of one thing that was really surprising from our initial analysis of this study, and that was the prevalence of pre-production plastic pellets, otherwise referred to as nurdles. And I wanted to highlight this because I think it's really important to note that plastic isn't something that just pollutes at the very end of its life. It's something that ends up being accidentally, oftentimes accidentally released into the environment throughout its life from the very beginning. And here we're looking at pellets that haven't even been formed into a plastic, a consumable object yet. These are pre-consumer plastic pellets. So you have them ending up in the environment from that moment, basically the moment of birth, throughout their life cycle. And with that, I will stop sharing and turn attention over to one of my fellow panelists.
Okay, our next section, thank you, Sam, it's excellent. Our second section, and just a reminder to people that if you have questions, please do put them into the chat room, and Mike will be gathering them and be ready to bring them forward at the end. So don't forget to put them in the chat room. We're now going to look at this whole issue of the international movement of plastic waste, and a very complicated issue. And two people are going to speak to it and pull it together, a lot of material into a short presentation. The first is Olga Speranskaya, and she's the co-director of the Health and Environmental Justice Support Intergroup Center. She does a lot of work internationally. She's a part of the IPEN, working internationally, amazingly proud of work of that. And the second speaker on this will be Faye De Leon, who was already introduced to you. She's the research and paralegal at the Canadian Environmental Law Association. So Olga and Faye, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you for showing slides for me. So in today's joint presentation, we will discuss challenges of plastic waste trade affecting Great Lakes Basin, with a focus on the documents relevant to plastic waste management, namely the new Basel Convention, Plastic Waste Amendments, and Canada-US Waste Trade Agreement and Arrangements on the transboundary waste transfer and transit. And next slide, please. First, I want to say that the Basel Convention is the only global convention on waste. And its objectives include minimizing all forms of transboundary movement of hazardous waste, minimizing generation of waste, and ensuring environmentally sound management of produced waste. So the convention controls the movement of hazardous and other waste through its provisions for prior informed consent. Hazardous waste are defined in Annex 138, and other waste is defined in Annex 2 and is also called waste for special consideration. They may not be hazardous, but they have to be controlled. So there is also Annex 9 on waste that does not require a prior informed consent. And today we will focus on plastic waste control that now falls under the Basel Convention. So why to control plastic? The driver for this was numerous data about plastic pollution crisis worldwide, and also the decision of China that was made in March 2018 to enforce ban on plastic waste import, which made it impossible to export any plastic waste to China unless 99.5 purity is achieved. So it became obvious that there should be a better control over plastic waste trade. And the only way to achieve this is through the Global Treaty on Waste Trade, which is the Basel Convention. So the new Basel Plastic Amendments were introduced in May 2019 and entered into force just in 9 months after that. Not a single party to the convention opposed the amendments. So the amendments were made to Annex 2 on other waste, Annex 8 on hazardous waste, and Annex 9 on waste not requiring prior informed consent. And the next slide, please. So the intention of the amendments is to ensure prior informed consent to control the transboundary movement of hazardous and non-hazardous plastic waste that are not likely to be recycled. So including such waste as plastic mixtures, contaminated plastic waste, and halogenated polymers like PVC, for example. So 4 groups of plastic waste were excluded from the Basel Convention control, provided they are destined for recycling in an environmentally sound way and almost free from contamination and other types of waste. And the next slide, please. So these 4 types of non-hazardous plastic waste are shown on this slide. So companies should ensure that these wastes are well sorted, halogen-free, destined for environmentally sound recycling, and almost free from contamination. And next slide, please. So a little bit about what it means to recycle waste in an environmentally sound manner. So actually, the Basel Convention does not provide a clear definition of environmentally sound management. However, in 2013, the parties adopted the framework for the environmentally sound management, which clarifies that stakeholders should respect the waste management hierarchy that includes prevention, minimization, reuse, recycling, other types of recovery, including energy recovery and final disposal. Though no definition of what exactly environmentally sound recycling means is provided. And next slide, please. So a few words about what is meant by almost free from contamination. So many countries export plastic waste that are not safely recyclable because of these contaminants. And that might be, for example, contaminants with other non-target wastes or even hazardous waste. It could be mixed plastic polymers, including those which are not intended to recycle safely. And plastic waste may contain intentional inputs of toxic additives. So it is important to understand the appropriate level of contamination. So as I already mentioned, in 2018, China prohibited all plastic scrap not meeting a purity tolerance of more than 0.5% contaminants. And at the end of 2018, China set the tolerance level of 0. So at that level, exporters have to separate and clean the waste prior to exporting it to China for recycling. So it is definitely possible to impose a 0.5% contamination limit for non-hazardous material in plastic waste to justify its imports without prior informed consent and for environmentally sound recycling. However, there is one more issue that needs to be addressed, and it is toxic additives in plastic. So next slide, please. So more than 140 toxic chemicals are used in plastics as plasticizers or other toxic additives. And on this table, you can see that just examples of such chemicals. But shipping plastic waste that contains toxic additives makes safe recycling impossible because these chemicals contaminate the recycling stream, the secondary recycling materials, and new products made of these materials. So the contamination limit for such chemicals should be way beyond 0.5%. In fact, there should be no toxic additives in plastic targeted for environmentally sound recycling. So next slide, please. So just a few words about Article 11 under the Basel Convention, because it sets rules for signing agreements and arrangements between parties and non-parties, which is very relevant to the agreements signed between Canada, which is a party to the Basel Convention, and the United States, which is not. So Article 11 allows to sign such agreements under certain conditions, and these conditions are listed on this slide. And the next slide, please. And I would like to go into some details about an agreement and an arrangement signed between the US and Canada back in 1986 and in 2020, which are relevant to our discussion today because they are on waste trade. So the agreement of 1986 was signed before Canada became a party to the Basel Convention. And it controls transboundary movement and transit of hazardous waste and other waste, and requires notification to importing and transit country. But it does not include new category of plastic waste, including mixtures of such waste in the definition of other waste, nor in the definition of hazardous waste, as it is now required under the Basel Convention. Moreover, it takes environmental sound management into account, but does not encourage it. So the arrangement of 2020 was signed 2 months before Canada formally notified of its ratification of the Basel Plastic Amendments. So arrangement of 2020 is complementary to the one of 1986 and is applied to non-hazardous waste not included under agreement of 1986, meaning that it concerns non-hazardous waste from Annex 9 of the Basel Convention. However, it does not specifically mention plastic waste that falls under Annex 9 of the Basel Convention, but refers to the agreement of 1986 instead. And furthermore, it does not specifically mention non-hazardous plastic waste under Annex 2 of the Basel Convention that requires prior informed consent. So the arrangement intends to apply environmentally sound management to non-hazardous waste, but includes recycling, recovery, and disposal, and not just environmentally sound recycling as required by the Basel Convention. So it also subjects waste movements to all existing controls normally applied in commercial transactions, which largely means lack of control. And finally, it claims to be non-legally binding, thus cannot be enforced as the convention, thus allowing just like weaker control for its implementation. So summing up, I would like to say that non-hazardous plastic waste is not specifically mentioned in these two documents signed between the US and Canada, though both documents are on waste trade. So it means that there is no clarity which non-hazardous plastic waste will require prior informed consent and which will not. And furthermore, the environmentally sound management mentioned in the arrangement of 2020 includes recycling, recovery, and disposal, meaning that it justifies energy recovery and final landfilling. And of great concern is that this arrangement will facilitate further movement of plastic waste-derived fuel going to cement kilns and steel mills both in Canada and the US. So without this arrangement, this would have to fall under the Basel Convention's rules, because the uncontrolled plastic waste under the Basel Convention cannot go to waste to energy and can only be recycled in an environmentally safe manner. And finally, there is nothing in the arrangement of 2020 to prevent the United States from taking the Canadian waste and exporting them to developing countries with no control under the Basel Convention. So we know that the US is not a party to the Basel Convention. And that would not be allowed if Canada tried to do this directly, because Canada is a party to the Basel Convention. So in this way, the United States can become sort of like a tool or a hub for uncontrolled plastic waste shipment. So, and so now I would like to hand over to Fe to continue our joint presentation, please.
Thank you, Olga. Can you advance the slide to slide 10, please? Can you hear me? Yep, thank you. Yep. So we spent the last 10 minutes just talking about the important development at the international and binational level when it comes to plastic waste management and control and movement. And I'm going to just add to that, you know, Canada has been undergoing and has committed to deal with plastic waste nationally. And it's been the federal government has initiated consultation in that regards. And it's important because it is part of the picture in terms of why it would be an issue when it comes to the Great Lakes Basin. So I just want to focus on the fact that this consultation, which focuses on integrated management approach to prevent and reduce products to prevent the waste of plastic waste, that the government is relying on very specific criteria for categorizing the use of single-use plastics, mainly looking at the environmental issues related to plastics, and that's basically based on data that's been collected through a variety of sources, demonstrating that the impacts may have on wildlife species. The second criteria is based on the problems associated with value recovery. It could be that the level of recycling for many of these materials is quite low, and that there are problems from the infrastructure perspective that doesn't allow for good recovery of materials designated for recycling. And the third point is around exemptions that might be considered for certain single-use plastics that exist in the market today. So looking at all of these three criteria is quite important for the government, and they've taken the steps to, analyze the data that's associated with these three criteria, and they came up with 6 categories of plastic items that have met the criteria specifically for 1 and 2 on environmental impacts and value recovery. And so at this particular time, these are the 6 items: plastic checkout bags, stir sticks, and 6-pack rings, cutlery, straws, and food services that are made from problematic plastics that have been targeted for potential bans and restrictions. And when we think about the problems associated with plastics, then we think about what does this mean for the Great Lakes. So if you can advance the slides to the last slide on slide 11. We identified a few areas of work that needs to be considered when we're looking at plastic waste management within the Great Lakes. We heard that the issue around plastic life cycle is an important feature, and looking at it from the perspective of not just end-of-life management is adequate, and certainly moving waste, plastic waste material from one place to another doesn't constitute a life cycle approach. So looking at it from the perspective of even before plastic production happens, from extraction down to the recycling or end-of-life management of plastic, is an issue that is relevant when you think about protecting the health of the Great Lakes. The second point is the fact that plastic pollution is known to impact water quality and the ecosystem health. And certainly from the perspective of a shared freshwater body, the roles of the binational response required to protect and restore the Great Lakes is certainly an issue that we've identified as an important feature when we're thinking about plastic waste management in the Great Lakes. We know that there are waste facilities certainly along the borders of the Great Lakes, and certainly along within the Great Lakes Basin that do various conduct various processes when it comes to handling and managing plastics that we are concerned around. And with that, associated with, I'm going to just jump to 5, which is possibly emissions to air from various toxic chemicals, whether they're in the plastics themselves or a result of the processes that are being conducted to deal with the waste. We know that products that result from recycling and production of materials that from recycled plastic material could also be subject to shipments of pellets to various points within the Great Lakes Basin. So we identified that as a potential problem, just the movement of that back and forth. And then, of course, there's that notion of plastic spills, which could happen at any point of the life cycle of plastics, and certainly hard to manage and hard to control. And we point to these 6 points, partly just to kind of redirect on the example that we're about to provide for the next speakers, just to think about that in terms of the challenges for the Great Lakes in terms of plastic waste management. So from that point, I think I'd like to pass it on to the next speaker, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Olga and Faye. It's very technical stuff. It really did a great job on it. Our final presentation is a shared one again, and it's on an example that Faye was just referring to that's in the preliminary stages. And the first presenter on that will be Sarah Bennett. She's the campaign manager for Clean Water Advocacy of Penn Future. And the second speaker will be Linda Lukasic, and Linda is the executive director of Environment Hamilton. So Sarah, I believe we're beginning with you.
John. Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking SELA and Toxics Free Great Lakes Binational Network for inviting me to participate today. My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm campaign manager for Clean Water Advocacy with Penn Future in Erie, Pennsylvania. Penn Future is a Pennsylvania statewide environmental organization working to protect water, air, and land, and to promote clean energy and sustainable communities. We just opened the Erie office last spring. I wanted to, and today I'll be talking to you about our concerns with plastics in Erie. I wanted to start first by just introducing some of you to Erie, just giving a broad overview of Erie as it relates to these issues. The city of Erie has approximately 95,000 people, and the county is has a population of about 275,000. The region, manufacturing is a major sector of the economy in the region, and plastic molding is is a stable portion of that sector. That's really important because the region has seen a decline in manufacturing jobs in recent decades, and so this has provided has been a stable portion of that sector. The city is doing a lot of work, like many Great Lakes post-industrial cities, is doing a lot of work to reinvent itself and to determine its post-industrial identity. Prior to COVID, tourism was a growing component of the economy in the area, bringing in about $1.2 billion to the regional economy. Fishing also attracts people from around the world to our shores, and we have a vibrant grape growing and wine country along the shores of Lake Erie. If you take a look at the map here, you'll see that there, north of Erie, jutting into Lake Erie, there's a peninsula. Most of that peninsula is Presque Isle State Park. And this really is a regional treasure and is actually the most visited state park in the state. I've organized many beach cleanups, both at this park and on other beaches in the region. And everywhere you go, you see plastic, from plastic pellets all the way to plastic litter and plastic bags. I also want to mention that Penn Future and 12 regional partners in the Erie region published Our Water, Our Future, a common agenda for protecting Pennsylvania's Lake Erie watershed in December of 2020. This document identifies threats to clean water in the region and recommends solutions at all levels of engagement to address those threats. And I bring that up today because plastic was among the major threats to water quality in the region that we identified in this document. And we recommend legislation at the state level to better regulate plastic pellets and flakes during transportation, transfer, and use. I also have these images on the right here just to remind us, and I know we've already heard from other speakers today, that plastic escapes into the environment during all steps of its life cycle. And also I want to remind everyone that it's not just plastic that's getting into the environment, it's the plastic additives that we've already heard about as well. We know that these additives are in the water, we know that they're in wildlife, and we know that they're in our bodies as well. So this is a big, plastic and plastic additives are a big issue. Last summer, a company called International Recycling Group announced in the Erie Times News publicly that they would open a first of its kind, very large plastic sorting facility in Erie, Pennsylvania. They plan to collect all types of plastic from a 750-mile radius. You can see that 750-mile radius in the map here to the right. I also want to note, since SELA is the group that invited me to present here, that radius does include Ontario, Canada, and that in a memo of understanding with Stelco in Nanticoke, Ontario, they did indicate that they might be collecting plastic from Ontario. The initial plan is to collect 275,000 tons of plastic per year from this radius and bring it into Erie. That same MOU with Stelco indicates that that could go up to 5 million tons of plastic per year. Once the plastic gets to the Erie plant, they plan to use a high-tech sorting process. That's the first of its kind. And that process will hopefully generate a more pure plastic streams. I want to note that this increased recovery, high-tech, more efficient sorting, and generating pure plastic streams are actually really important parts of fixing our plastic recycling issues that we have. And then the rest of that proposal is that plastic will be flaked. Once the plastic is flaked, the marketable plastic, which at this point are numbers 1, 2, and 5, will be sold for recycling. And the other plastics, the non-marketable plastics, will be combined into a proprietary blend and then shipped to Stelco in Nanticoke, Ontario, to be used as a partial coke replacement in the steelmaking process. So I pointed out that this proposal, the increased efficiency is an important one to address plastic recycling problems, but we do have a number of environmental concerns with this. Given that plastic is such a huge problem worldwide and that we're located in the basin of the largest freshwater system in the world, it's important that we raise environmental concerns around new processes and facilities to make sure that we're moving forward in a responsible way and also with accountability. So we have a number of environmental concerns with this, but the major concern and of interest to this webinar today is this concept of plastic flakes being transported across the lake. So plastic flakes can especially escape during transfer from one mode of transportation to another, and as those flakes are shipped across the lake. These concerns are incredibly valid given the state of plastic and plastic pellets and plastic flakes across the world, really. Just to kind of give you an example, last year in February, there was a shipping container that leaked millions of plastic pellets in Norway. In August, a shipping container fell into the Mississippi in Louisiana, and they're still having plastic pellets wash up onto their shores. And then more recently in Maine, a ship bringing plastic from Ireland to Maine, a shipping container was lost again, and they've had shredded plastic washing up onto their shores for months since. And so we know that plastic spills happen worldwide. We know that when plastic spills into the ocean, it contributes to the problems that we've already heard about today. And we know that spilled plastic is largely unrecoverable. And so I'd like to end my presentation today to just share with you a few of the major questions that we continue to have. Among those questions are, what specific mechanisms and backup mechanisms will be used to prevent flaked plastic from escaping during transfer and transport? What are the mechanisms of accountability for plastic pollution if it does occur? For example, what does a spill response look like if we have spilled plastic getting into the lake? Will increased plastic recovery and recycling result in less plastic entering waterways? And what impact will proposals like this one have on reduction of plastic production and use? And then finally, will a facility like this lead to additional plastic infrastructure in Erie, Pennsylvania, Erie County? And what environmental load will come with that? So thank you very much for listening. I'll pass it on to the next presenter.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. All right. Thanks, everyone. I also appreciate the opportunity to be able to present to you today. My name is Linda Lukasik. I'm the Executive Director of Environment Hamilton. We're based in Hamilton, Ontario on Lake Erie, and we've been around for almost 20 years as an organization. Our organization has a mandate to provide Hamiltonians with knowledge and skills to enhance and protect the environment around them. And for those south of the border who don't know, Hamilton is really the steel capital of Canada. So that's partly what brings me here to speak to you today. So one example of the kind of citizen science that we engage in is our Stack Watch program. And this is all about helping people to learn how to observe, document, and report problem air emissions from the steel sector in our community. So in this picture, you see a fridge magnet that we hand out to community members. On the left side of the screen, you'll see it's actually a blast furnace bleeder pop, so a release of some problem emissions from a blast furnace. And on the right side, an example of emissions from the coke oven battery of one of the mills in our community. I want to very quickly give you some context. You've heard from Sarah about the proposal to move plastic. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the air regulatory frameworks that exist in Ontario that regulate the steel sector. So in the case of the steel sector air emissions, they are regulated under Ontario Reg 419, that's our local air quality regulation, and it provides 3 routes to compliance. Companies either demonstrate compliance with air standards. If they can't do that, because we do have new, much stricter standards, they can request and must work towards meeting a site-specific standard. And there's also a third option, and that is that industrial sectors can meet a technical standard. And in the case of the steel industry, there is no technical standard yet. There's one in the works. So right now, pretty much every mill in the province has site-specific standards for particular contaminants. In the case of Stelco, which has a plant in Hamilton and in Lake Erie, their Lake Erie Works facility has 2 site-specific standards, one for benzene, which is a human carcinogen, and another for suspended particulate matter. And it's worth noting that in Ontario, we don't regulate the finer, respirable, and inhalable particulate. It's all one category of suspended particulate matter. I also should add that any of these mills that have site-specific standards are also mandated by the ministry to establish community liaison committees, and those committees meet quarterly to hear about progress at these facilities and meeting their site-specific standards. So there is a vehicle there for these facilities to communicate with the public. I want to shift now to talk about the Lake Erie Works for Stelco. This is a shot from the company through a presentation that they gave that shows the pier at the facility. So you'll see it's right along the shorelines of Lake Erie. And you can see in the forefront there are actually some cottages in the scene as well. And it's an interesting facility. It was opened in 1980, and you can see it's surrounded by rural. So it's out on the edge of Nanticoke. It's not a heavily populated area. If you look immediately to the east where it says Hickory Beach, that's the site of the old Nanticoke coal-fired power plant that was closed in 2013. So I'm also going to give you, because blast furnace pictures very prominently in this proposal, an iron making 101 explanation. So when you're looking at a blast furnace, it involves feeding iron ore and limestone along with coke, and coke is pure carbon that's created by literally baking coal in the coke ovens. It's fed into the top of the oven, and you can see there are layers of coke and iron ore. And it's basically a reduction reaction, where you can see in the tiers at the bottom, the standard practice now is to feed in what's called pulverized coal. So it's PCI injection along with oxygen to get the reduction of iron oxide to iron. And you can see that it also generates carbon dioxide. So I want to help you to understand some of the pressures we're seeing to find other things to feed into blast furnaces in order to address this challenge with carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas generation. So I'm going to describe in a Hamilton context, we talk about greenhouse gas emissions from the steel sector as the climate elephant in the room. And this bar graph really helps you to understand that. You can see that the highest contribution that we see in the city of Hamilton for greenhouse gas emissions is from our 2 steel mills. And one of those mills is not even fully operational. Next, right below is other industries. And then down much further, we have sources from residential and commercial buildings and transportation. So for us, the steel sector is really the giant climate elephant in the room. And the sector is facing pressure to really do something about the greenhouse gas emissions that they're producing. So the Canadian Steel Producers Association has made a very ambitious commitment to realize 0 CO2 emissions by 2050, and they're trying to figure out how to get there. And that kind of takes us back to this conversation about plastic pellets. And one of the things that we're seeing happen is exploration of what I've termed novel reductants. So different ways to deal with reducing that iron oxide to iron in the coke ovens, but substitutes that are going to generate less greenhouse gas emissions. So I talked about pulverized coal being injected, and that was actually a step to help reduce the amount of coal needed, all in a quest to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But now that there's a more aggressive effort to reduce GHGs, we're seeing the exploration of novel reductants, including plastic waste and that's what you're hearing about in this proposal, and high carbon materials like biochar. And so then it becomes an interesting exploration in the research around biochar versus plastic waste. And the research seems to be pointing to the fact that you can realize greater greenhouse gas emission reductions with the use of biochar. There are also challenges with feeding those plastic pellets into a blast furnace. So we see increased emissions to air, for instance, of heavy metals like mercury, and increased levels of heavy metals like mercury, cadmium, lead, and zinc in the blast furnace waste materials that end up in landfill. And of course, there could be challenges over time with that issue. So I just want to jump back. Here's the side view of our blast furnace again, and a pie chart from the Canadian Steel Producers Association that really emphasizes blast furnaces are the largest greenhouse gas emission source in the steel production process. So it's a whopping 68% contribution. So I want to share some of what we've already seen happen with Stelco Steel in Ontario. The company has a reputation for innovating where climate action is concerned. So I'm very familiar with one example in Hamilton with the company's coke oven plant, where they have a really innovative partnership with Walker Environmental. They're literally shredding up railway ties and feeding that biocarbon into the coke oven as a way to displace 5% of the coal that they would otherwise be using. So there's one example, and the company has kind of hit the sweet spot. They know 5% still gets them the good quality coke that they need for steel production, but it's also helped them just to take a step towards greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The company also has at their Lake Erie works the first commercial carbon abatement algae plant. So they are literally feeding carbon dioxide generated by the steel production process into a system to generate algae that is then used for other commercial applications. So some interesting innovative things happening there that I wanted to acknowledge that are depending on biocarbon to make them happen. It's also important to understand that on the Canadian side, we have a research association known as the Canadian Carbonization Research Association. It includes all of our major steel industries, and it's very much focused on biocarbon. So you can see I've circled one of their research targets involves 100% replacement of the injection of coal into the blast furnace with biocarbon. So you can see that the general direction of the industry, even through their participation in this research association, is that quest to use the biocarbon in the form of things like biochar to get to where they want to go. I wanted to finish by acknowledging that if we look across the ocean at what's happening within the European context, the ultimate goal, and it's certainly what we want to see as the ultimate transition in a Canadian and a North American context too, is the transition to blast furnaces that are completely fossil fuel or petrochemical free. And you can see this example here of green hydrogen fueling that blast furnace process to produce the molten iron that we need to make steel. So what I would say here is that there's a real potential and it makes sense for us to be embracing biocarbon in the form of biochar to help us with that ultimate transition that we know at the end of the day in a North American context is going to take some advocacy and probably some government support. But the endpoint really seems to be the best option from an environmental point of view where the steel sector and the production of iron is concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah and Linda. Excellent. And we have 20 minutes left, which is our objective. So I turn it over to Mike to lead us through the questions and the rest of the meeting.